The notification arrives at 3:47 a.m. Dubai time, lighting up thousands of phones simultaneously across the Emirates medical community. A single video link, shared through encrypted messaging apps, spreading like digital wildfire through hospital corridors, medical staff lounges, and the private WhatsApp groups where doctors and nurses gossip about matters they'd never discuss publicly. Within the first hour, the video has been viewed 12,000 times. By dawn, that number will triple. By noon, it will have reached every major hospital in the Gulf region. And by sunset, 3 of Dubai's most prominent surgeons will be dead, their reputations destroyed, their families shattered. Along with them will die the woman at the center of it all, Celeste Marquez, a 29-year-old Filipina operating theater nurse whose beauty and ambition had made her both desired and dangerous in equal measure. But this isn't a story about a woman who used her sexuality to climb social ladders or manipulate powerful men. This is about what happens when 3 successful surgeons, bound by professional rivalry and male ego, discover they've all been sleeping with the same woman. When pride becomes more toxic than any surgical infection. When the operating theater that saves lives becomes the stage for the deadliest kind of human drama. Stay with us, because what you're about to hear will destroy everything you think you know about the medical profession's code of ethics, about the invisible hierarchies in Dubai's expatriate community, and about how quickly modern technology can transform private intimacy into public execution. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button now, because this story goes places that will make you question whether the people saving lives in hospitals are equipped to handle the complications of their own hearts. Celeste Marquez had learned early that beauty was currency, but intelligence was capital. Born in Davao City, Philippines, she'd grown up watching her mother work triple shifts as a domestic helper in Kuwait, sending money home that kept 5 children fed and clothed and educated. Celeste had been the eldest, the one who bore responsibility like a second skin from the moment she could understand what sacrifice meant. She'd excelled in nursing school not just because she was smart, though she was brilliant, but because she understood that excellence was the only escape route from the poverty that had defined her childhood. While other students partied or dated, Celeste studied with obsessive focus, graduating top of her class with specialization in perioperative nursing, the highly skilled work that happens inside operating theaters where surgeons perform their miracles. Theater nurses aren't like floor nurses. They don't comfort patients or manage medications or deal with the messy humanity of recovery. They exist in a rarefied space where precision matters more than empathy, where a single mistake can mean death on the table, where surgeons depend on their skills absolutely. It's a role that requires nerves of steel, encyclopedic medical knowledge, and the ability to anticipate a surgeon's needs before they're even articulated. Celeste was exceptional at it. By the time she arrived in Dubai in 2019 at age 26, she already had 3 years of experience at a major Manila hospital and certifications that made her one of the most qualified nurses in the Filipino expatriate community. Dubai's American hospital snapped her up immediately, offering a salary that was quadruple what she'd been making in Manila. But it wasn't just her skills that made her valuable in the operating theater. Celeste had inherited her mother's striking beauty, high cheekbones, luminous skin, and dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets even when they held nothing at all. In the sterile, high-pressure environment of the OR, where everyone wore identical scrubs and surgical masks, beauty shouldn't have mattered. But it did. It always does. Dr. Marcus Chen was the first to notice her. At 41, he was the hospital's chief of cardiothoracic surgery, a position he'd earned through a combination of Stanford medical training, hands that could perform miracles on failing hearts, and political skills that had navigated him through the treacherous waters of hospital administration. Born in Singapore to Chinese parents, educated in America, practicing in Dubai, Marcus embodied the kind of international elite that thrived in the Emirates. Wealthy, skilled, and perpetually displaced from any single cultural identity. He was also married, with 3 children in private school and a wife who'd long ago resigned herself to being a doctor's widow, present in name but alone in practice. The marriage wasn't unhappy exactly, just empty. The kind of arrangement where partnership had calcified into cohabitation, where conversations revolved around scheduling and finances, where intimacy had become as rare and perfunctory as the obligatory birthday gifts they exchanged. The first time Celeste assisted in one of Dr. Chen's surgeries, she'd anticipated his need for instruments with such precision that he'd paused mid-procedure to look at her. Really look at her, not just as a pair of hands, but as a person. "You've done this before," he'd said, his voice slightly muffled behind his surgical mask, but carrying approval that was unmistakable. "Yes, doctor," she'd replied, her own mask hiding a smile. "Coronary bypass is standard procedure." But it wasn't standard, not the way she did it. Over the following weeks, Dr. Chen specifically requested Celeste for his surgeries. At first, it was purely professional. She made his work easier, anticipated complications, created an efficiency in the OR that improved patient outcomes. But somewhere between the 5th and 10th surgery they worked together, something shifted. It started with coffee. Dr. Chen mentioned being exhausted after a particularly grueling 8-hour operation. Celeste offered to bring him coffee from the staff lounge. He invited her to share it in his office. The conversation that followed had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with loneliness. "Do you ever feel invisible?" he'd asked, the question coming from some vulnerable place that successful men rarely revealed. "Like you're performing a role so completely that the real you has ceased to exist?" Celeste had understood exactly what he meant. She'd been performing roles her entire life. Dutiful daughter, perfect student, professional nurse. Behind each mask was a woman who barely recognized herself anymore. The affair began 3 weeks later in a hotel room at the Jumeirah Beach Hotel. Dr. Chen had invited her to discuss surgical protocols over dinner. They'd both known it was a lie. They'd both shown up anyway. The sex itself was unremarkable, hurried, guilty, complicated by the logistics of adultery and the awareness that they were crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. But the intimacy afterward, the lying together in expensive sheets talking about their real lives, their real fears, their real selves that they hid from everyone else, that was the drug that would prove addictive. "I could leave my wife," Dr. Chen whispered in the darkness, his hand tracing patterns on Celeste's bare shoulder. "We could be together properly." But Celeste, who understood men better than they understood themselves, knew this was a lie. Men like Dr. Chen didn't leave their wives. They compartmentalized. They built separate lives and told themselves the deception was kindness. And Celeste, who had learned long ago that love was luxury she couldn't afford, accepted the arrangement. What she didn't anticipate was how quickly her reputation would spread through the hospital's informal networks, or how that reputation would attract exactly the kind of attention she should have avoided. Dr. Rashid Al-Mansouri was everything Dr. Chen was not. Where Chen was controlled and methodical, Rashid was charismatic and bold. An Emirati national in his late 30s, he'd studied orthopedic surgery in London, returning to Dubai with skills that made him the first choice for the wealthy and powerful who suffered sports injuries or degenerative joint conditions. But more than his surgical skills, Rashid possessed something that gave him immense power in Dubai's hierarchical medical system. He was local. An actual citizen in a country where 90% of the population were temporary residents who could be deported with a phone call. His family's connections reached into government. His patient list included members of the ruling families, and his word carried weight that foreign doctors like Chen could never match. Rashid had noticed Celeste within days of her arrival at the hospital. But unlike other doctors who admired her from a distance or made inappropriate comments that she deflected with professional coolness, Rashid was patient. He watched her work, assessed her skills, and recognized that she was too intelligent to be seduced with cheap flattery or crude advances. Instead, he made himself indispensable to her career. When she mentioned wanting to pursue advanced certifications in minimally invasive surgical techniques, Rashid arranged for her to attend workshops that would normally be restricted to senior staff. When her visa renewal hit bureaucratic complications, He made a single phone call that resolved everything instantly. When she mentioned her family in the Philippines facing financial difficulties, he arranged for performance bonuses that coincidentally coincided with her exact needs. Celeste wasn't naive. She understood exactly what Rashid was doing, but she also understood that in Dubai's medical hierarchy, having a powerful ally was worth more than maintaining some abstract moral high ground. Besides, she told herself, accepting his help didn't obligate her to anything more. She was wrong. The shift happened 6 months into her affair with Dr. Chen, during a medical conference in Abu Dhabi that brought together surgeons and surgical nurses from across the UAE. Dr. Chen had declined to attend, citing patient obligations. Dr. Al-Mansouri had specifically ensured Celeste's name was on the attendance list. The conference itself was legitimate. Presentations on new surgical techniques, networking opportunities, continuing education credits. But everyone knew the real business happened in the evenings, in hotel bars and private suites where professional relationships became personal ones, where deals were struck and alliances formed over expensive whiskey and carefully maintained discretion. Rashid found Celeste in the hotel bar after the final evening session, looking exhausted and slightly overwhelmed by the aggressive networking that characterized these events. His approach was perfect, concerned rather than predatory, offering her a quiet place to escape the crowd rather than making his intentions obvious. "You look like you could use rescue," he'd said, his English carrying the particular accent of someone educated in Britain but rooted in Arabic. "There's a terrace upstairs, much quieter, better view." The terrace overlooked Abu Dhabi's glittering coastline, the Gulf waters dark beneath a sky full of stars that city lights couldn't completely obscure. They'd talked for hours, about medicine, about their respective journeys to their current positions, about the strange experience of being expatriates in a country that was simultaneously welcoming and forever foreign. "You're wasted in the OR," Rashid said at some point deep in the conversation. "You should be teaching or in research or running surgical programs. You have the mind for it." It was the first time anyone had seen Celeste as more than exceptionally skilled hands. Dr. Chen appreciated her competence, but within strictly defined boundaries. Rashid saw possibilities she'd barely allowed herself to imagine. The kiss, when it happened, felt almost inevitable. And unlike the guilty, hurried encounters with Dr. Chen in rented hotel rooms, the night Celeste spent with Rashid in his Abu Dhabi hotel suite felt like something else entirely. Not love exactly, but recognition. Two ambitious people who understood the games they were playing and the stakes involved. "I can protect you," Rashid said in the early morning hours, his arm around her as dawn broke over the Gulf. "In this country, in this hospital, you need someone with real power. Chen can't give you that. He's just another foreign doctor who will be replaced when his contract ends." Celeste heard the unspoken offer. "Choose me over Chen. Let me be your patron and protector. Give me exclusivity and I'll give you security." But Celeste, who had learned long ago that dependence was dangerous, didn't choose. She simply added Rashid to her carefully balanced equation, managing two affairs with the same precise skill she brought to managing surgical instruments in the OR. For 3 months, the system worked. Dr. Chen never suspected his time with Celeste was shared. Dr. Al-Mansouri assumed his patronage had earned him priority. Celeste moved between them with the careful choreography of someone walking a tightrope, always aware that a single misstep would mean disaster. What she didn't anticipate was that the hospital's social ecosystem was more transparent than she realized. That other nurses noticed when she left work with Dr. Chen heading in the same direction. That administrative staff tracked when she submitted time off that coincidentally aligned with Dr. Al-Mansouri's conference attendance. That the invisible network of gossip and observation that characterized any workplace was mapping her movements with precision she couldn't detect. And she definitely didn't anticipate the third surgeon. Dr. James Morrison was the hospital's rising star in neurosurgery. At 36, He'd already published groundbreaking research on minimally invasive brain tumor removal and had a patient survival rate that made him one of the most sought-after specialists in the region. British by birth, educated at Oxford and Johns Hopkins, he represented the absolute pinnacle of medical excellence. He was also profoundly lonely. The intensity required for neurosurgery left little room for relationships. His engagement to a fellow surgeon had collapsed 2 years earlier when she'd accepted a position in Boston and he'd chosen Dubai. Since then, his life had been consumed by 18-hour days, research that required obsessive focus, and a loneliness that had calcified into accepted fact. James noticed Celeste during a rare joint surgical procedure, a patient requiring both cardiothoracic and neurological intervention after a severe accident. Dr. Chen led the cardiac repair while James handled the cranial surgery. Celeste, as the senior theater nurse, coordinated both teams with a competence that impressed even James, who had impossibly high standards. But what caught his attention wasn't just her skill. It was a moment during the surgery when complications arose, when the patient's blood pressure crashed and chaos threatened, when Celeste's voice cut through the panic with clarity that restored order. Dr. Chen, you need manual compression on the aortic root. Dr. Morrison, the cranial bleed is secondary. Stabilize brain pressure first, cardiac output second. She'd been right. Her instant assessment of priority had saved the patient's life. And in that moment, James had seen her not as a nurse, but as a colleague, someone whose intelligence matched her technical skills, who thought like a surgeon even though the system would never allow her to become one. The relationship that developed between them was different from her arrangements with Chen or Rashid. James didn't proposition her or offer inappropriate career advancement. Instead, he asked her opinion. He consulted her about complex cases, genuinely interested in her perspective. He recommended her for a research project studying surgical outcomes, acknowledging her contribution in ways that gave her professional credibility she'd never experienced. Celeste found herself drawn to him in ways that surprised her. With Dr. Chen, the appeal was stability and the validation of being chosen by someone powerful. With Dr. Rashid, it was the intoxication of being seen as special by someone whose local status made him untouchable. But with James, it was something more dangerous, intellectual connection. Recognition of her mind, not just her body or her utility. The affair began almost accidentally. Late night working on research data in the empty hospital research library. Conversations that extended past professional boundaries into personal territory. A shared meal that turned into shared confidences. And then, one night when exhaustion and proximity and accumulated attraction reached critical mass, something more. James fell completely. In his ordered, controlled, intellectually dominated life, Celeste represented chaos and passion and all the humanity he'd suppressed in service of surgical perfection. He didn't just want an affair. He wanted a future. "I love you," he told her 3 weeks into their relationship, the words coming with the same absolute certainty he brought to surgical diagnoses. "I want to marry you. I want to build a life with you." Celeste, who had never expected this complication, felt terror, because unlike the manageable arrangements with Chen and Rashid, James's intensity threatened to expose everything. Love demanded exclusivity. Marriage required honesty. And Celeste's carefully constructed system of managed deceptions couldn't survive either. "I need time," she'd said, buying space to figure out how to extricate herself from a situation that was accelerating toward disaster. But time was the one thing she didn't have, because the hospital's gossip network had finally connected the dots. Celeste Marquez, the beautiful Filipina theater nurse, was sleeping with not one but 3 of the hospital's most prominent surgeons. And in the competitive, ego-driven world of medical politics, that information was a bomb waiting for someone to detonate it. The someone turned out to be Dr. Patricia Wang, a senior surgical nurse who'd been passed over for the research position given to Celeste. Patricia had watched Celeste's meteoric rise with growing resentment, attributing every achievement to sexual manipulation rather than genuine competence. She'd collected evidence over months: photos of Celeste leaving hotels with different doctors, screenshots of text messages accidentally left visible on hospital computers, testimony from other nurses who'd witnessed intimate moments. Patricia compiled everything into a devastating dossier. And then, instead of reporting it through official channels where it might be buried by administrators trying to avoid scandal, she did something far more destructive. She leaked it online. The video was expertly edited, set to music that made it feel like a true crime documentary. It opened with Celeste's nursing ID photo, then cut to a montage of security camera footage showing her entering hotel lobbies with 3 different men. The footage had been obtained illegally, pulled from various hospital and hotel security systems by someone with technical skills and vengeful motivation. But the security footage was just the setup. The real devastation came from the private photographs and text messages. Images of Celeste with Dr. Chen in intimate settings, dates clearly visible proving the affair had lasted nearly a year. Screenshots of WhatsApp conversations between her and Dr. Rashid that were explicitly sexual and impossible to misconstrue. Photos taken at medical conferences showing her, and Dr. James Morrison in poses that suggested far more than professional collaboration. The video's narration, delivered in robotic text-to-speech, laid out the timeline with prosecutorial precision. How Celeste had begun with Dr. Chen, securing his patronage before expanding to Dr. Al-Mansouri, leveraging his local influence while maintaining her original affair. How she then entrapped Dr. Morrison with the appearance of intellectual connection while continuing to service the other 2. How she'd extracted career advancement, financial support, and professional opportunities through systematic manipulation of powerful men. The video ended with a question that would echo through Dubai's medical community like a disease. If she's this deceptive in her personal life, can we trust her competence in the operating theater where lives hang in the balance? The video went viral with terrifying speed. Within the hospital, it spread through every WhatsApp group and email thread before administrators could even attempt damage control. Beyond the hospital, it reached the broader Filipino expatriate community, the medical professional networks, and eventually the general public who loved watching the powerful brought low. For the 3 surgeons, the exposure was catastrophic, but affected them differently based on their individual circumstances and vulnerability. Dr. Marcus Chen discovered the video when his wife called him at 6 a.m., her voice cold with a fury that had been building through years of suspected infidelities, now confirmed beyond denial. She didn't scream or cry. She simply informed him that she'd contacted a divorce lawyer, would be pursuing maximum financial settlement, and that their children had already been told their father was a cheater who destroyed their family. Chen's professional reputation collapsed simultaneously. Though hospital policy didn't explicitly forbid relationships between doctors and nurses, the exposure of an affair conducted while he was married violated the moral clauses in his contract. More damaging was the evidence that he'd used his position as chief of cardiothoracic surgery to secure preferential treatment for Celeste, requesting her for surgeries, influencing her schedule, creating professional opportunities that other nurses hadn't received. By noon on the day the video leaked, Chen had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. By evening, his name was trending on social media throughout the Gulf region, associated with words like predator and abuse of power. The hospital's legal team was already preparing the documentation that would terminate his employment and ensure he'd never work in the region again. But for Dr. Chen, the professional destruction was secondary to the personal devastation. He genuinely believed Celeste cared for him, that their connection transcended the transactional nature of Dubai's expatriate relationships. To discover he'd been one of 3 simultaneous affairs, that every intimate moment he'd treasured had been replicated with other men, that his special relationship was actually a managed commodity. It shattered something fundamental in his understanding of himself. Dr. Rashid Al-Mansouri's response was different. As an Emirati national with family connections, he initially believed he was immune to consequences. His wife, who came from an equally prominent family, had endured previous infidelities with the resigned pragmatism of women in her social class. Divorcing him would mean losing access to the lifestyle his wealth provided and potentially damaging her own family's social standing. But the public nature of this exposure changed everything. Rashid's wife wasn't just another betrayed spouse. She was a woman whose humiliation had been broadcast to everyone in their social circle. Her family demanded he restore their honor. His own family, deeply conservative despite their wealth, saw the scandal as stain on the Al-Mansouri name. Within 24 hours, Rashid had been forced to resign from his position at the hospital under pressure from hospital administrators who couldn't protect him when his own family was demanding accountability. His wife filed for divorce with terms that would cost him tens of millions in settlement. His patients, many from the same elite circles that valued reputation above all else, began canceling appointments and seeking other surgeons. But Rashid's greatest rage was directed not at his destroyed marriage or career, but at the other men. He'd believed Celeste was his exclusively, that his patronage had earned him special status. To discover she'd been simultaneously sleeping with Chen, and Morrison felt like theft of something he'd purchased and paid for. Dr. James Morrison's collapse was the most complete. Unlike Chen, he had no wife to betray. His relationship with Celeste had been unencumbered by marriage vows. Unlike Rashid, he had no family connections to cushion his fall. What he had was a reputation built entirely on professional excellence and ethical conduct, both now destroyed by association with a scandal that made him look foolish at best, predatory at worst. The hospital moved quickly to separate him from the institution. Though he'd done nothing technically illegal, the exposure of his relationship with a subordinate nurse violated policies about power differentials in medical settings. The research project he'd been leading, which had featured Celeste as a contributor, was now suspect. Had she earned her position through merit or through sexual manipulation? But the professional devastation was secondary to the emotional destruction. James had loved Celeste. Genuinely, completely, naively. He'd been planning their future, imagining marriage and children and building a life together. The discovery that she'd been simultaneously conducting affairs with two other surgeons didn't just hurt, it revealed him as a fool. The brilliant neurosurgeon who could navigate the most complex anatomical structures in the human brain had been completely blind to the most basic human deception. And Celeste herself? She became the most hated woman in Dubai's expatriate community overnight. Social media exploded with commentary that was vicious in its misogyny. She was called every degrading name invented for women whose sexuality threatens male pride. She was accused of being a prostitute, a con artist, a predator who used beauty to destroy good men. The Filipino community's response was particularly painful. Many saw her as an embarrassment who confirmed every negative stereotype about Filipino women abroad, that they were gold diggers, that they used sexuality to climb social ladders, that they couldn't be trusted around successful men. Filipino nurses who'd worked for years to build professional reputations found themselves suspected of similar behavior simply by association. Within 48 hours of the video's release, the American hospital had terminated Celeste's employment for violation of professional conduct policies. Her work visa was immediately canceled, giving her 30 days to leave the country. Her bank accounts, which had contained savings from years of work, were frozen pending investigation into whether she'd received any financial benefits that constituted bribery or prostitution. She was evicted from her apartment when the landlord decided having a woman of her reputation in his building might affect property values. She couldn't return to the Philippines because the shame there would be worse than anything Dubai offered. Her family would be ostracized, her nieces and nephews bullied, her mother crushed by humiliation in a culture where female sexual purity was paramount. Celeste was trapped, professionally destroyed, financially ruined, socially radioactive, and legally required to leave a country that now saw her as toxic while unable to return to a homeland that would view her as permanently tainted. But the story's real tragedy was still to come. Because in the toxic mixture of male ego, public humiliation, and destroyed futures, violence was becoming inevitable. The three surgeons' worlds had collapsed, but they'd collapsed separately. Dr. Chen was staying with a colleague, unable to face his wife or children. Dr. Rashid had moved to a hotel to escape his family's disappointed fury. Dr. James Morrison was living in his office at the hospital, technically suspended but still occupying space he'd inhabited for so long he didn't know where else to go. They'd all been betrayed by the same woman. They'd all been exposed to public humiliation. They'd all lost careers, marriages, and futures to the same calculated deception. But they hadn't yet confronted each other. That changed when Dr. Rashid received a message from an unknown number. "We need to meet, the three of us. There are things about Celeste you need to know. Come to the construction site at Palm Jumeirah, Building C, midnight. Come alone." The message was sent to all three surgeons from a burner phone that couldn't be traced. It promised answers, explanations, perhaps some way to salvage meaning from the wreckage of their lives. What it actually was bait, and all three of them took it. The construction site sat in the half-finished development that characterized Dubai's endless expansion, a skeleton of a future luxury high-rise surrounded by construction equipment and raw materials. It was isolated, unmonitored, and accessible despite security fences that were more suggestion than barrier. Dr. Chen arrived first at 11:45 p.m., his car parked a block away, approaching on foot with the paranoia of someone whose trust had been destroyed. He found nothing but concrete floors, exposed rebar, and the ghostly echo of his footsteps in unfinished stairwells. Dr. Rashid arrived at 11:50 p.m., his presence announced by expensive cologne that preceded him through the construction site's dusty air. He found Dr. Chen standing in what would eventually be a penthouse unit, looking out at Dubai's glittering skyline through empty window frames. "You," Rashid said, his voice carrying contempt mixed with recognition. "She was fucking you too." "Apparently she was fucking everyone," Chen replied bitterly, "including you." They stared at each other across the concrete floor, two men who'd had nothing in common beyond medical degrees, and now shared the deepest humiliation either had experienced. Dr. James Morrison arrived at exactly midnight, his British punctuality intact despite everything else in his life falling apart. He found both men already there and understood immediately that they'd all received the same message. "Who sent this?" he asked, looking between them for answers neither possessed. "Does it matter?" Rashid replied. "We're all here, we're all ruined, and we're all victims of the same lying whore." "Don't call her that," James said reflexively, some instinct to defend Celeste surviving even betrayal. "Why not?" Chen interjected. "What else do you call someone who sleeps with three men simultaneously while pretending to care about each of them individually?" The argument that followed was circular and pointless. Three brilliant men who dedicated their lives to precision and science, now unable to make sense of human emotion. They catalogued grievances, compared notes on how they'd been manipulated, searched for meaning in a situation that defied rational analysis. What none of them noticed, until too late, was that they weren't alone at the construction site. Celeste emerged from the shadows at 12:30 a.m., her appearance shocking all three men into silence. She looked nothing like the polished beauty from the viral video. Her hair was uncombed, her clothes rumpled, her eyes carrying exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness into something that looked like surrender. "I sent the message," she said, her voice steady despite visible trembling. "You all deserve to know the truth." "The truth?" Rashid's laugh was bitter. "We know the truth. You're a calculating bitch who used us all for career advancement and financial gain." "No," Celeste replied. "That's the story everyone else is telling. That's not what happened." "She'd brought them here to explain," she said. to help them understand that she'd never meant to hurt anyone, that each relationship had begun genuinely, without calculation, that she'd cared for each of them in different ways, filling different needs in her own life while apparently filling needs in theirs. "I loved you," James said, the words emerging like a physical wound. "I was going to marry you. How is any of that real if you were sleeping with them at the same time?" "I don't know," Celeste admitted. "I don't know how to explain that I had real feelings for all of you, that each relationship felt true while it was happening, that I'm not the monster the internet has decided I am." "But you are," Chen said quietly. "Because regardless of your feelings, you deceived us all. You let each of us believe we were special when we were actually interchangeable." The conversation spiraled through accusation and defense, blame and attempted explanation, anger and grief and confusion. What it didn't include was any path forward, because there was no redemption available for anyone in that concrete skeleton overlooking Dubai's false paradise. What happened next would be disputed in the investigation that followed. Each surviving participant would have different memories, conflicting testimonies about who said what and who moved first, and who bore ultimate responsibility for the tragedy that unfolded. But certain facts were indisputable. At some point, Dr. Rashid advanced toward Celeste with aggression that may or may not have been intended as physical violence. Dr. James Morrison moved to intercept him, protecting Celeste even after everything. Dr. Chen tried to separate them, and in the struggle that followed, on the edge of a floor that had no safety railing yet, with Dubai's lights glittering below like promises none of them would keep, someone fell. Celeste's scream echoed through the construction site, bouncing off unfinished concrete. By the time the three surgeons reached the edge and looked down, her body lay motionless on the construction debris 6 floors below, her neck bent at an angle that even laypersons would recognize as fatal. For several seconds, all three men stood frozen, staring at what they'd done. Not what any one of them had done individually, but what their collective rage and humiliation and male ego had created. "She slipped," Dr. Rashid said finally, his voice barely functional. "During the argument, she stepped back and lost her balance. It was an accident." "Was it?" Dr. Morrison asked, his surgeon's brain already replaying the sequence of events and finding gaps in that narrative. "It has to be," Dr. Chen replied, "because if it wasn't an accident, then we're murderers." They stood there in the darkness, 3 brilliant men who dedicated their lives to preserving life, staring at the death they'd collectively caused. The choice before them was simple: call police and face investigation that might reveal their actions as manslaughter or murder, or cover up the death, and hope that a woman who'd already been so thoroughly destroyed by public scandal might plausibly have taken her own life. They chose silence. 3 successful, educated professionals who knew better, who'd taken oaths to do no harm, who'd built careers on ethical conduct, chose conspiracy over accountability. They wiped the construction site of obvious evidence of their presence. They left separately, agreeing to maintain that none of them had received any mysterious message or had any knowledge of Celeste's location that night. Celeste Marquez's body was discovered at 6:15 a.m. by construction workers arriving for their morning shift. Police investigation concluded it was suicide. A woman destroyed by scandal and facing deportation had taken her own life rather than face either Dubai's judgment or Manila's shame. The investigation found no evidence of foul play, no suspicious circumstances beyond the tragedy itself. The 3 surgeons maintained their silence. Each left Dubai within weeks, their careers in the region finished regardless of whether they faced legal consequences for Celeste's death. Each carried the weight of knowledge they'd never share, the truth buried beneath layers of self-preservation and calculated amnesia. Dr. Marcus Chen returned to Singapore, where his medical license still held validity and his family scandal was distant enough to be manageable. He opened a small private practice, treating minor cardiac conditions for patients who cared more about price than prestige. He never married again. Dr. Rashid Al-Mansouri remained in Dubai but never practiced medicine again. His family's wealth was sufficient that he didn't need to work, and his reputation was too damaged for any hospital to employ him. He became one of Dubai's invisible wealthy, present but irrelevant, existing in luxury but stripped of purpose. Dr. James Morrison disappeared completely. Some reports placed him doing volunteer medical work in rural Africa. Others claimed he'd abandoned medicine entirely, last seen teaching English in a remote village in Thailand. He'd loved Celeste, and her death, whether by accident or collective violence, had broken something in him that medical skill couldn't repair. And Celeste herself? She was buried in a cemetery on the outskirts of Dubai, designated for expatriate workers who died far from home. Her family in the Philippines held a memorial service but couldn't afford to repatriate her body. Her mother never recovered from the shame and grief, dying less than 2 years later from complications of diabetes that might have been manageable with less psychological stress. The viral video remained online, a permanent record of destroyed lives and moral failure. Comment sections filled with judgment about Celeste's behavior while mostly ignoring the 3 powerful men who'd used their positions to seduce a subordinate, then potentially killed her when their egos couldn't survive her having agency over her own sexuality. In the end, 4 lives were destroyed by a story that the public reduced to nurse sleeps with 3 doctors. But the real story was more complex and more tragic, about poverty that creates desperate choices, about power differentials that make consent ambiguous, about male ego that turns betrayal into justification for violence, and about how quickly modern technology can transform private human complexity into public morality play. The operating theater where Celeste had worked with such skill remained. New nurses filled her position. The 3 surgeons she'd been involved with were replaced by other doctors who heard the story as cautionary tale about avoiding entanglements with hospital staff. Life continued with the ruthless efficiency of systems designed to be larger than any individual tragedy. But sometimes, late at night when Theater 7 is empty and waiting for tomorrow's scheduled surgeries, the staff swear they can still smell Celeste's distinctive perfume, still hear her voice calling out instrument names with the precision that had made her exceptional, still feel her presence in the space where she'd been most truly herself, competent, confident, and irreplaceable. Whether that's ghost story or collective guilt is impossible to say. What's certain is that Celeste Marquez, the beautiful Filipina nurse who dared to be desired by powerful men and paid the ultimate price for that audacity, left a mark on that operating theater, and everyone who'd known her that time couldn't erase. The moral of this story, if it has one, isn't about the dangers of promiscuity or the consequences of deception. It's about what happens when society builds systems that reduce human beings to commodities, then punishes them for trying to navigate those systems with whatever tools they possess. About how men in power face embarrassment while women face destruction for the same behaviors. About how violence becomes inevitable when ego and shame and collective guilt have nowhere else to go. If you found this story disturbing, you should be. Similar tragedies play out across the globe wherever power, poverty, and patriarchy intersect. Subscribe if you believe these stories matter. Share if you think silence is complicity. And remember, in the operating theater of real life, we're all both surgeon and patient, capable of healing and harm in equal measure.